the nation running the trade deficit is effectively consuming more than it's producing. And by contrast, a nation that is having the trade surplus is consuming less than what it is producing. And so it's living below its means, basically. And the nation that has a trade deficit is living above its means. Trump was effectively equating the country to a business and talking about winning in monetary terms. But America in real terms, and that means in actual stuff, is getting more stuff from the world than it's exporting. That is improving the quality of life of Americans.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are continuing our conversation about Stephanie Kelton's fantastic The Deficit Myth. This is part 5. We hope you'll check out the first 4 in this series, which I've linked to in the show notes for this episode. And we're on to chapter 5, which is called Winning at Trade. And she puts winning in inverted commas. And that'll become apparent why later on. And Stephanie starts each chapter with an economic myth, a piece of conventional wisdom, and then debunks it. And the way she starts this chapter is, quote, myth. A trade deficit means that America is losing. Now, she's written America, but the insights on trade in this chapter apply to many other currency issuing nations like the UK, Japan, Canada, Australia, to name but a few. So, Patricia, for those of us not in the US, does a trade deficit with the rest of the world necessarily mean our country is losing some global game of trade?
No, is the short answer. And I think Stephanie talks about specifically about Trump's campaign and how it was heavily about how is America losing at trade. And she does well in discussing why that messaging resonated so much. So just in the same way that very often politicians equate government to a household, and it's something that people can relate to, Trump was effectively equating the country to a business and talking about winning in monetary terms. And I guess that makes sense for somebody like him, right? Who is a businessman. But the issue is that if America in real terms, and that means in actual stuff, is getting more stuff from the world than it's exporting. So that is improving the quality of life of Americans. And all they have to do in return is give the dollar, which is something that they produce and they have infinite amounts of. It's a reflection of how much the rest of the world, the willingness of the rest of the world to accept dollars in exchange for real stuff. Right. So in a sense, it's a reflection of Americans' privilege. They're not losing. They're very much winning at this.
And just to start out with Stephanie's point, she writes after the myth, she writes reality. A nation's trade deficit is its stuff surplus. I really like that framing of it. It cuts to the meat of the issue that trade deficits are stuff surpluses. So how does Warren Mosler put it? A nation's real wealth is everything you can produce domestically, plus everything the rest of the world wants to send to you, minus the stuff you have to send to the rest of the world, to get the stuff it sends to you. Trump's idea about winning at trade is if we get more money from the rest of the world, that means we're good at making stuff and the rest of the world wants to buy our stuff, like you say, Patricia, like a business. So we're winning because we're piling up dollars.
But we have dollars.
Exactly. Yeah. If they're running a trade surplus against the rest of the world, you'll be sending the world more stuff that you made than it will be sending you that it made. So it's kind of backwards when you look at it through the macro framework of if you were a country. In fact, the way Warren's often talks about it, shop to win. And he uses this in relation to tariffs, that you want to get more for your money, right? So putting tariffs on things, making imports more expensive. Warren will go, this guy thinks that we're not paying enough for steel, so he's going to make it more expensive. At the beginning of the chapter, Stephanie writes about places in the US like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania that have been hollowed out in terms of job by trade liberalization. And we've got similar hollowed out communities here in the UK. And it's framed as us losing a tug of war to hang on to jobs. I would say that framing is unhelpful to 99% of us. If you're on the top, you probably want to pit every single worker in the world against the other workers in the world and pretend that's all about efficiency, and have the rest of us ultimately competed with slave labor somewhere in the world, maybe here in the UK before long. But Patricia, for the rest of us, as politicians constantly reinforce the foreigners are stealing our jobs narrative, what's a better way to think about trade?
It's really amazing to me how successful this narrative has been, getting workers to actually argue for lower wages.
Yeah.
The whole idea is very much premised on the fact that the government has no role in creating employment, right? And that all we can do, or the best that we can do, is be appealing enough to capital so that investment comes in. And I think that Stephanie talked about this as well, how the narrative, Trump's narrative, it made sense to a lot of people because it seemed like an obvious explanation. Well, if we exported more, then I would have a job. The issue is that the whole thing is premised on, well, if we want to export more, it means that we have to produce more at home. And in order to do that, we have to produce more at home. And in order to do that, to become more attractive to investment, we need to lower wages, in which case it's not a benefit to these people. And B, another way of looking at it is, well, in order to export more, then we have to consume less at home. And that means making people poorer. So these are all kind of the internal restructuring that you hear about a lot, and you heard it in the context of Greece and things like that. And it really sort of leaves the government out of the job creation discussion. This is just, what does business want?
They're looking at the whole question through the lens of the real asset here is a job.
Yeah.
And the jobs are flowing out of the country. But really, like you say, jobs aren't a scarce resource that the country is snatching away from us. And obviously, as the book progresses and talks about Pavlina Chernova's work on the job guarantee, we put out a recent episode of one of Pavlina's talks at the MMT Summer Seminar that you went to, Patricia, about, well, she calls it the original sin in the money creation story is in the first instance, the government creates unemployment by going, okay, you need to bring it to Warren Mosler's guy with a gun analogy. Who wants to earn one of my business cards? Nobody. Okay, but there's a guy with a gun at the door and you need one of my business cards to get out of the room. Now everybody needs to earn a business card. Okay, the guy at the door is the tax man, and the tax man and this whole arrangement has just created 100% mass unemployment in the room. And I very much like that model, as regular listeners will know, because it emphasizes the source of unemployment and therefore the responsibility for not rectifying that, or what Warren calls the base case for analysis of a currency, is that you unemployed everybody for the further purpose of everybody working to provision the public purpose. And more than that, you don't want to tax all of the financial assets off of the private sector because we don't want the government doing everything. We want the government to spend more than it taxes so that the private sector then has spending power left to do the other things. We don't want the government running all the hamburger stands, whatever, making all the clothes. So anyway, I would say, yeah, I think the focus on the jobs as the assets that are flowing between the countries is probably the mistake, given that joblessness is the starting point for the inception of the currency, and therefore the responsibility for full employment really does rest on the shoulders of a currency issuer, I would say.
Yeah, and I think you're getting at something that's really key here, is that the government has engineered this situation, right? It has engineered the unemployment that we're seeing, and then it has engineered a situation where people, as you say, are being pegged against people in other countries. They're being told the only way you're going to get a job is if you in the developed world, who have over years and years fought for more workers' rights, are going to compete with this random country that hasn't gotten there yet. And you have to figure out how you get the job because that other guy is willing to work for pennies. That's the sort of situation that they create, but it's entirely, as you're saying, within the government capacity and responsibility to fix I don't know, well, not mistake, but the original sin, right?
I quite like that you said mistake, because that is kind of Moslerian.
Yeah.
I think that's how Warren would say it, isn't it? Like he presumes innocence, innocent frauds, all that. Okay, it's just better. It puts the emphasis on the other person to defend their position.
I mean, you're not trying to exploit people. It's just a mistake, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do you want to rethink that policy? Yeah. But again, I think that the emphasis on the money story, the MMT money story, is, I think, even though it doesn't slip down ever so easy, and there's a lot of different ways to say it, and you probably have to have somebody's attention if you want to talk about it, rather than putting it on a bumper sticker or using it as an elevator pitch. You probably have to get people to go through a few narrative turns before they understand what you're saying. We're not saying the guy with the machine gun representing the tax man, we've chosen a guy with a machine gun because we think the government's evil and that's what they do. We're just using that to represent, okay, that's the force of law. Okay, yeah, a guy with a machine gun doesn't show up when you fill out your tax returns or when every time you're about to pay VAT, just in case you decide not to pay VAT on the thing that you bought in the January sales or whatever. You know, you generally don't think about not paying tax because you don't mess with the IRS. If you're an American, you don't mess with the Inland Revenue if you're here in the UK. And it's analogous to having that force of law, basically. That's what the guy with the gun is doing. The guy with the gun is not doing it because government and organisation and provisioning the public purpose is evil and coercive. It's just that this is the way we do it now. If you want an NHS and hospitals and schools and all the good stuff, the government has to spend something. And in order to make that something worth earning, the government has to do this tax system thing. So I don't consider this to be coercion.
As long as that government is democratic, right?
Yeah, exactly. I know that there are problems with democracy. I don't think the solution is to abolish democracy. At this point, my thinking could evolve. It's a worthwhile debate having, but it still doesn't change the fact that this is the way we do it at the moment in countries where they have floating exchange rate currencies. This is the money story. This is how money comes into existence.
I often hear people say, well, MMT just wants to fix capitalism, right? Yes and no. Like MMT as a theory, it doesn't care what system we have. And there's a point, there are things that MMT makes possible that you start then questioning, is this still capitalism? Or that start getting a bit hazy. But that could be perfectly possible if you understood the money as described by MMT. So I would say MMT is not partisan to any particular system. It's simply seeing immediate problems, and its advocates, I guess, are proposing solutions that fix problems that we have right now. But then later on, it doesn't stop us from questioning whether this is a system that we want or not.
I think whatever your politics are, I can't see any of our situations being improved by unemployment or not having a strong healthcare system. But like you say, Patricia, we always have to remind people that, the money story itself, as described by MMT, is neutral. So, at the time of writing the deficit myth, it was the Trumpian era, and Trump was imposing tariffs on steel and aluminium coming from most countries. And Stephanie and also MMT founder Warren Mosler, who we've been talking about, and pretty much anyone who understands trade through the MMT lens has a problem with tariffs as a way to, quote unquote, bring jobs back. Why is that, Patricia?
Well, I think there's a place for tariffs in general in trade. I don't think we should never discuss tariffs. We often talk about trade has to be as free as possible, and that's the aim, right? And I would argue, no, that's not the aim. I think tariffs can serve as a useful tool in some contexts, especially, for example, if you have nascent industries in your country that you want to develop. Sometimes tariffs can serve as a means of protecting that. And also, if you don't agree with more on an ethical point of view from importing things from abroad, or you think some things are not good quality enough, you can do that. As a social type of policy, you can do that. But as a means of bringing jobs back, it's not really useful, because what you end up doing is you're not changing anything else in the economy. You're just imposing a tariff, and that constitutes effectively a tax on your population for importing things. And taxes can be useful, as I said, as can tariffs, but it's not going to increase the jobs by themselves. In essence, they're making things more expensive for your country's population. And that means there's probably going to be a decrease in demand, and that's probably even going to create more unemployment. The way to create employment is by increasing government spending, government investment, etc., and not through tariffs.
And like you said a while ago, Trump sees piling up money as winning, because he's thinking like a billionaire. He's thinking like a currency user, right? Rather than a currency issuer, which he's in charge of a currency issuing state at the point he's imposing these tariffs.
He measures success with dollar signs. Yeah. And when you are a businessman, that's a good thing. But when you are in government, that's a really bad thing.
Yeah. Like you say, those tariffs are going to end up impacting the consumers in the host nation. If you want to protect an industry, then actually go bottom up and spend investment money into that industry, and maybe impose tariffs as well.
Japan is a good example. I think they have really high tariffs on rice from abroad. But I think that's more of a cultural issue. They really want to protect the type of rice that they produce at home. And that's fine. I'm sure they provide support as well for home producers of rice. And that's how they protect that. And you can do that, but you cannot just fix everything by imposing tariffs.
And obviously it's political theatre as well. Or maybe not even as well. Maybe it's only political theatre, particularly when it comes to Donald Trump. And it's going, oh, yes, this sort of strongman leader is coming in and just telling those foreigners where it's at by extracting money off them. And it's like, well, no, that's not. This policy is extracting money off you for no reason. Do you know what I mean? The government is not short of dollars.
It's a really good way of, to be fair to Trump, it's a really good way of convincing people that taxes are good for them. I mean, it's incredible how...
Yeah, I'm sure that's exactly what he meant.
Yeah.
While we're talking about jobs, in this chapter of The Deficit Myth, Stephanie reminds us that, quote, joblessness is an official policy of the US, unquote. And it's the same in the UK and all countries with a central bank. What does she mean by jobless is an official policy?
Well, as our main strategy for dealing with inflation is monetary policy. And that's what the central bank is meant to be in charge of, right? And many countries in the Western world and abroad see a central bank as a good thing, an independent central bank, that is, for them to then fine-tune the economy by increasing or decreasing interest rates. What they don't say, or you don't hear it very often, but it is, the whole premise is based on this idea that there is a trade-off between inflation and employment. And that therefore, if inflation gets too high, the way to decrease that is to increase unemployment. And that's what they're trying to do with the interest rate going up. And with the interest rate going down, they would try to stimulate the economy and job production. But there is that the whole thing is premised on a theory, which is that you can never have full employment, because that would mean inflation and potentially hyperinflation. Inflation would just go crazy. And so we have a policy inbuilt in these countries that means that there always have to be unemployed people, and there just exist to keep inflation down.
Absolutely, yeah. I was just trying to find this thing that I saw today on Twitter. It was basically a front page lead story in The Economist. The headline was basically something like, America needs more unemployment. That's just
wow.
And I think the person who tweeted it was saying, look, they're not even pretending to be non-partisan in this class war, basically.
How do they frame that? How do they frame that as a benefit to the working class?
Well, here's the thing. They don't, and we're encouraged not to think about class politics, which is a reason that I very much like David Graeber's thing of this idea of the 99% and the 1%, because I think it probably shakes down along that, like 99% of us are workers. We have a boss, right? And who's pitching and who's catching sort of thing. So he carved up the battle lines that way and just recognize that, hey, whether you think it's in poor taste to talk about there being a working class and there being an ownership class or a ruling class, or it's antagonistic, you should realize that, well, the other side to you, they're quite comfortable with that antagonism. They know what side they're on, and they write articles like America needs more unemployment, or the world needs more unemployment because we don't like this CPI number that's come up. We want the money that we've got to have more purchasing power, and the way to do it is to throw more of the rest of you people under the unemployment bus.
They don't frame it as a class war. They frame it as a technicality, right?
Yeah.
So
this is technocratic. Yeah.
Yeah, it's technocratic. And the whole idea of independent central banks is to make something that is actually very class related just a technicality. It's just how it's done. Don't question it.
Yeah, so I think I maybe said this in the last episode, or maybe even the last 10 episodes. The job guarantee proposal, that the government become the employer of last resort as a way of the government fixing its mistake and leaving too much residual unemployment in the economy, leaving any residual unemployment in the economy due to there not being enough spending power in the economy to give everybody a job. I often couch that as, okay, either there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, in which case implement a job guarantee, or there isn't a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, in which case implement a job guarantee. It's just a no-brainer. But while we're on the topic, I should recommend for anyone new here that another great read, and I'm pretty sure it has to be the first general audience MMT book, is MMT founder Warren Mosler's 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, which is free online, and I'll link to where you can find that if you haven't already read it. And Warren uses this similar device that Stephanie would end up using later on for her book, which is to describe the conventional wisdom and then debunk it. And Warren in his book calls these fallacies, these pieces of conventional wisdom, innocent frauds. And the book's called 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds. Anyway, Stephanie's chapter 5 rhymes with Warren's chapter 5. And the way Warren's chapter heading is innocent fraud number 5, trade deficits are detrimental. And then the fact is, trade deficits directly improve our standard of living. Could you say a bit more about that, Patricia?
Well, it means that the nation running trade deficit is effectively consuming more than it's producing. And by contrast, a nation that is having the trade surplus is consuming less than what it is producing. And so it's living below its means, basically. And the nation that has a trade deficit is living above its means. I think that's the simplest way of looking at it.
And so just to get into the plumbing of what's going on in the money system, In the previous chapter, Stephanie introduces a model of the money system where there are two buckets. One's the government bucket and the other is the non-government bucket. When the government is spending, it's pouring dollars from the government bucket into the non-government bucket. So it's adding to the stock of net financial assets for the private sector. And then when the private sector pays taxes, it's pouring dollars from the non-government bucket to the government bucket, and the level of net financial assets for the private sector goes down as a consequence. And in this chapter, she's introducing a third bucket, the foreign sector bucket. And it's really splitting the non-government bucket in two. The non-government consists of domestic US citizens and firms holding dollars, and people and firms outside of the US holding dollars. And the point remains that if the US government spends more than it taxes, i.e. it runs a deficit, then the corresponding surplus has to, by accounting identity, show up in one of those two buckets of the non-government sector, either in domestic bank accounts or dollar accounts held by overseas people and firms. And that's the big theme in the book, that a deficit for someone is a surplus for someone else, and it depends on who you are in this sectoral balance picture. So really what's happening when that foreign sector bucket got dollars going into it is that other non-US economies are exporting to the US and piling up dollars and saving them in the form of treasuries. But people in the US think that's bad, right? Because treasuries are characterized as the national debt. How does MMT change that picture?
It makes you realize that that's not bad. It just reflects the other country's desire to accept dollars and to save dollars for presumably a rainy day. And I guess the reason why the US dollar has so much debt and has so much debt issued to countries abroad is because it's a very well accepted currency out there. And many countries see this as a means to safeguard against potential lack of resources of something and increase the resilience, I guess, of their economies by having this currency that is so widely accepted. But it also means that there is no danger of never going bankrupt because of this debt, because of course the US can never go bankrupt and can always issue dollars. So the US isn't going to run out of dollars through this debt. And also, I guess something Warren Mosler would say is that you need to think about the sequence, right? How did this happen? The US considers this debt and that is paying on these dollars, but they would not have been able to obtain these bonds, these dollar bonds that the US issued, if these countries had not first obtained dollars from the US through trade, right? So the debt is in a way a consequence of the US's trade deficit. And of course, the dollar is something that the US government can issue.
Yeah, without operational limit.
Without financial limit.
Yeah, so really, I think it all comes from this idea. The word deficit has got the DE in the beginning of it. So people are like, oh yeah, the deficient deficit devil, right? And you always kind of have to come back to Stephanie's aphorism that trade deficits are stuffed surpluses, or every deficit represents a surplus somewhere else, and who's holding the surplus. And so in the case of the US, the stuffed surplus is flowing to the US, and that's how the exporting nations that have exported to the US have piled up their dollars. And rather than just having a pile of dollars, they'd rather have interest earning dollars, which are US treasuries. So they buy US treasuries. And that really is it. They've moved their non-interest bearing dollars from a current account at the Federal Reserve to a savings account that pays interest at the Federal Reserve. Now, Americans might be concerned that paying interest to people just for having dollars might not be a good way to incentivize all kinds of things. When we call it corporate welfare, our government does it as well. You can buy gilts, and there should be access to and facilities for people to save for retirement. But that's not how the government bond system is working as set up at the moment. It's not all about retirement. It's more about a basic income scheme for people who already have money, as we've said many times on this show. It might be worth at this point saying something about sovereign wealth funds. I can understand why a nation might do it. It might not want all of its savings to be in one currency and one asset class. Maybe dollars are ultra safe if you're not Afghanistan or another government the US just decides to punish for domestic political theatre.
Or if you plan to just do as you're told when it comes to the US,
exactly.
dollar may be super safe.
My point is you never know when you're going to end up on the naughty list. So it seems reasonable to diversify away from it. I mean, I know Norway's got a famously big sovereign wealth fund, hasn't it, from its energy exports. And I guess all you'd want to say about that is if the government of Norway are saying to its people, no, we can't spend on that, we can't spend on this because of what it might do to the sovereign wealth fund, then that's obviously a misuse of what is going on with sovereign wealth funds. But if it's just basically accumulated foreign denominated assets and it doesn't want to save in dollars or any particular thing, it makes sense to me to have a sovereign wealth fund. I don't know what you think, P.
I mean, the strategy here is resilience, right? Is to try and safeguard the future by keeping a fund in a foreign currency for a rainy day when your country is struggling, right? And you need to sustain, I don't know, your standards of living, or you're worried about provisioning the basics, or you import things that are actually quite fundamental to your population and not just kind of luxuries. So it might make sense, but I would argue that there are better ways of safeguarding. And I mean, the best way possible is to produce what you need at home, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't trade, that there's always going to be trade. That's a great thing. But if an item really is so fundamental to your country's well-being, say food, and I don't mean caviar from France, I mean like basic vegetables and the things that everybody needs to live, or machinery that happens to be essential for running your basic industries at home, then it might make more sense to have the capability to produce those things at home. And that way you are less exposed to what may be happening abroad, to changes in circumstances that are beyond your control. But a wealth fund could work alongside that as long as it's well run and you're not massively impoverishing your population in order to obtain it.
It's a bit like deficits and government debt, the national debt. These are our assets, actually. That's how we get to hold pounds. That's how we get to have net financial assets that aren't created out of private sector debt, where the government spends them into existence. And so we have a national debt, and we're always trying to sort of make people think about, okay, if it's a debt to the government, who is it an asset to? And answer that question before they worry about the national debt. So I think just as, say, the national debt can get weaponized for political ends, as we've seen over here in the UK in the last few weeks, it's been pretty turbulent, and the rhetoric around the debt and having to reduce debt as a percentage of GDP over the long term and stuff is as a justification for cutting public sector spending and not giving nurses pay rises that have been due for like more than a decade, and just generally lowering our standard of living within the country, our own government doing that to us. It's all been due to the weaponization of the national debt. It's certainly helped the ideology. If you're an ideologue that wants to shrink the state, talking about the national debt is a pretty effective way of doing it, as the last few years have proved. So in this chapter, Stephanie cites the work of our regular guest, Fidel Kaboub, and she introduces the concept of monetary sovereignty. How would you go about introducing someone new to MMT to monetary sovereignty?
I've been thinking about the best way of framing this, and maybe it's easier to go about what MMT describes as monetary sovereignty in technical terms, which is a country that issues its own currency and taxes in that currency, and that has little to no foreign denominated debt, and that has not pegged its own currency against either a commodity or another currency. A simpler way to understand it without the technicality attached to it is that monetary sovereignty simply increases the nation's choice to exert policy, economic policy. And I know that it's the debated term because I think very often it gets framed or it gets related to isolation. in this inward looking approach. I don't think it does that. I think, as I said, monetary policy is about choice. It's not about, I don't want to collaborate with other countries, or I don't want to join efforts with other countries to do certain things. It just means that you have a choice, that you can say no, but you may choose to say yes. So I think that's really important.
There's this other thing that Fidel talks about often, which is a country running trade along the lines of importing high value added goods and exporting low value added goods. Now, why is that approach to trade a trap for developing economies?
In terms of the trade trap, these high value added imports very often are quite essentials to the economy. So if you think, for example, of a country like my own, Peru, you have value added imports like machinery and things that are pretty essential to the home, sort of to other industries, which are agricultural and mining and things that are considered low value added. And the problem with that is that you need to export a lot more of low value added in order to obtain the high value added products. So in order to sustain a decent standard of living with the high value added products, you need to export a lot of low value added exports. And that means that comes with destruction of ecosystems and a lot of issues at local level. But it also tends to mean that the priority is so placed on, well, the only way to get more of these fancy imports is to export more and more. And that means that all the focus in the economy goes to these low value added products. And then no focus is placed at all on, well, what if we, instead of importing this stuff, we just developed it here? And it really causes a neglect, and it sort of traps you into this thing where you are highly dependent on other countries for the kind of things that you need to get your economy going. And as well as a good example is Venezuela, actually, because Venezuela exports the crude oil and then it exports it to America. And then it comes back as an added value export because it's refined in America. So they have to export a lot of crude in order to import some refined oil. So I think that's the trap that Fidel talks about.
And like we say, falling into this trap is another thing that can eat away at a nation's monetary sovereignty. Now, I know that, for instance, Warren Mosler, founder of MMT, who deserves all respect and thanks, he's not a fan of this term monetary sovereignty because I think he would say it's complicating something that doesn't need to be complicated. If you've got a free floating exchange rate currency regime, you can spend for full employment. And let's keep things simple. And yeah, I kind of agree with that. But I also think if you bring up monetary sovereignty, and people are interested and you're able to unpack those concepts within, it has explanatory power about why things happen, like you just outlined, Patricia. People will go, well, if a nation issues its own currency, what happened in Venezuela? If a nation issues its own currency, what happened in Zimbabwe? And the idea of the concept of monetary sovereignty and having a decent grasp of it can help you understand what's happening.
I think it also denotes the fact that no MMT has said this just from my own head. So if I'm horribly wrong, shoot me down. But it does denote the encroachment of another economy. The things that we talk about as being monetary sovereignty and the three things that we're saying you should not do, right? Those three are basically allowing another country to encroach on your domestic policy. And the reason why I'm saying this is because if you borrow in a foreign currency a substantial amount of money, then you have to honor that debt. And you have to therefore take care that you're spent in accordance to maintaining a certain exchange rate so that you can honor that debt. And that means, therefore, that the foreign country's priorities are more important than provisioning for full employment or by extension of public purpose in your own country. So that, to me, is the key. And then, of course, when we talk about issuing your own currency, of course, if you're using another country's currency, like say Ecuador uses the US dollar, then you're allowing the US to have a certain degree of control over your economy. It might not be obvious, but it does restrict what the national government can do for its own people. So in that sense, I find that term useful because it is ultimately about politics.
it gets people focused on the real stuff. But politics is real. Again, I know that, so like we say, the MMT lens, the mechanism of government spending and taxing, that's apolitical, right? This is just how governments spend. But it means that you can focus on the politics, which is what determines the distribution of the blessings of your nation, I guess, which is why understanding the money system is vital. So precisely which goods and services are being imported and exported has consequences. And as Stephanie puts it in The Deficit Myth, the quality of trade is at least as important as the quantity. And something I hadn't considered until one of our episodes with Dirk Entz is that for, say, China, when transnational companies do their production in China, so BMW have a factory in China, Apple get their stuff made in China. When these firms put factories in China, in a way you could say that China's strategically importing know-how or the means to create the technology for themselves. So even though real goods are leaving China and dollars are coming into China, or more accurately, China's reserve account at the Federal Reserve, China's still importing something that's going to potentially change things significantly in the long term in terms of industrial capacity and hopefully the material conditions of regular Chinese people going forward. But while we're on this topic, I came across an interesting interview with a guy called Chris Miller, who wrote a book called Chip War. And part of its thesis, as I understand it, is that computing power is what the world economy runs on, to at least or even to a greater extent that it runs on oil. Because, for instance, without chips, ships can't navigate, missile guidance systems can't operate. We saw what the chip shortage did to car prices recently. So anyway, he's saying the source of this computing power is cutting edge microprocessors. And because the chip industry leaders in the US made the choice a few decades ago to offshore development, the markets become way more monopolistic than even the global oil market. And the point we're at today is that one factory in Taiwan has become very systemically important to the whole world economy. And to me, that kind of explains some of the recent US posturing about the Asia Pacific region and Taiwan. And it underscores something that I've been thinking about for a while, which is that this is why the US focuses its industrial policy on the Pentagon system so much, so that in the event some part of the world stops wanting to sell them, say, energy or food or computer chips, if you're the monopoly supplier of the means of delivering brutality, governments around the world are always going to need your arms for whatever they'll politely sell to their public as national security, but probably most people will experience it as repression. But anyway, if you're at the cutting edge of that industry, you're always going to be at the top of the decision-making institutions globally that decide who gets what. So back to monetary sovereignty. So as I count it, there are three ways a nation can undermine their monetary sovereignty with their currency regime. And we touched on pegged currencies like Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Jordan, dollarization, which you mentioned, Patricia, El Salvador, Ecuador, Panama. But the third one, as I see it, currency union. Now, the euro is a currency union among nations without a political union. Can you talk about why that's a problem, P?
If you were to consider the US as a currency union, it just happens to be a currency union that works because it also has a political union attached to it, right? And the whole politics of how do you get a political union to be successful is a whole other topic as well. Do you need a common sense of identity? You need a shared history, or maybe you don't need any of those. I don't know. But what is happening in Europe, the issue is that there is no political union, and then you have a currency union. And the politics is really what is driving your economic priorities, right? And this means effectively that every country in Europe has a different economic priorities, and then that then restricts. But if you're not a highly influential country within that union, then your priorities will be at the bottom of the pile, effectively. So you have countries like Germany and France being quite influential on ECB politics and policy, and whereas other countries, predominantly the southern countries, don't have as much say in the issue. I think that does affect the monetary sovereignty of these nations. But I think that the question is, you may want to fix this by just adding the political union on top and then saying, well, okay, are people going to want that? Within the context as well in which a lot of countries don't feel heard, or a lot of areas within the Eurozone don't feel heard, how do you sell a political union as being beneficial to them? You have to perhaps restructure the whole parliament and the whole way that you make decisions at Eurozone level in order to persuade all these areas that they will have equal say, or something like that. There's a lot of ways that you can go about this, but if keeping the euro is the priority, then you would have to make the case that it will be ultimately beneficial to keep that politically sustainable. Or you could go the other way and say, look, this is not going to work out. Countries in Europe are way too different. They have way too different priorities. And then you go into, let's just give everybody back their own currency and work as we did before. But part of the issue as well is that the way that it's been run at the moment is that you have a currency union, but then even those countries that are very much in control of the union tend to use politics to blame other countries for hiding structural issues with the Eurozone. So, for example, there was a lot of narratives of Greek people and Spanish people being characterized as being lazy, and that was being used to justify high levels of unemployment within those countries. And that was terrible. That's not the behavior of somebody that wants to be a political union.
Yeah. And again, when you feed into it the MMT money story that we said near the beginning, the government, the currency issuer in this case, like we say, there's no sort of centralized government attached to the currency issuer, I guess is what we're saying in the case of the euro, creates unemployment. In order to solve it, the residual unemployment is the result of the issuer not leaving enough spending power in the economy. And again, so to blame the victim basically is what is happening there in that case that you just talked about.
So it's a very dysfunctional family at the moment. And at some point, they're going to have to make a choice either way. So we'll see. At the moment, the way that I'm seeing this progressing is that slowly, countries are giving in more sovereign powers to the central kind of union and the ECB. But I would much prefer to just have a huge referendum. Let's just have a huge European-wide referendum and ask.
Oh, God, I can't believe you've still got an appetite for referendum.
No, but at the moment, they're not even asking. That's the point I'm making. They're just doing it, but slowly. And then kind of they'll go 90% of the way there. And then at the end, they go, okay, now we're going to have a referendum to make it official. But by the way, we're already 90% of the way there. And that's the issue I have. I'd much rather have an open discussion about what this would mean and see what happens. But I think within that concept, I would hope that the whole structure of the European Parliament would be discussed. The whole fact that countries feel underrepresented, or the whole fact that they still treat each other with a level of competition, even though they are part of the European Union.
So here's a talking point that comes up quite often, P. What are people on about when they say the US is the only country that can do MMT because the dollar is the world reserve currency? And then people in the US say we can't do MMT or we'll lose our world reserve currency status. And it's just three words that kind of are used to sort of shut down thought on this front. How should we think about this concept of the world reserve currency?
I find it quite strange, actually, because like what they're trying to get at is this idea that, okay, well, there is a lot of demand for the dollar, therefore the US can do whatever it wants. But there is demand for the pound, and it just may not be as much as for the dollar. And also, by the way, what is this do MMT?
Yeah. I know.
Right. I think the issue is that what they're trying to say, and saying it very badly, is that they think that the US is the only truly monetarily sovereign nation in the world. Okay. And this is where this kind of framework of monetary sovereignty being a spectrum might actually serve to exacerbate this view that, well, the US is at the top, so they are the only ones that are truly sovereign. And it's not. It's really not. The UK can maintain full employment. All these countries can maintain full employment. It doesn't really matter if your currency is the world reserve currency or not. it doesn't undermine your ability to maintain full employment.
And while we're on the topic, even as we've just been talking about the Eurozone, even the Eurozone countries can maintain full employment. There can be a job guarantee in the Eurozone, which Dirk Entz and Pavlina Chernova have proposed. And also Warren Mosler also co-wrote a paper about that quite a few years ago as well. And I think maybe a simple way to cut through all that world reserve currency thing, I think in the deficit myth, Stephanie says the dollar is the dominant trading currency. I think that's the way to say it. It's just that a lot of trade is done in dollars. And part of that is because the world wants to export to the US and they're piling up dollars, right?
I think there is an element of saying as well that what they're saying is that their exchange rate would not suffer when the government spends a lot of money. And first of all, there is no sort of, just because you're having full employment, it doesn't mean that your exchange rate will suffer. That's not a link, right? But also the fact that your exchange rate can go up or down does not undermine your ability to have full employment.
And that's why you have a floating exchange rate.
Yeah. And if full employment is what do MMT means,
yes.
then no, it doesn't stop you from doing MMT.
Yeah. And one last thing on the topic, Stephanie in the book quotes L. Randall Wray, just a short sentence, the dollar will not always reign supreme, is the quote from L. Randall Wray. Just a recognition of there might come a time when the import-export situation will flip the other way. The US might not always be a net importer. And at that point, there'll be a lot fewer dollars piling up in foreign hands, I guess.
Yeah. And one thing we don't discuss very often, but that is worth considering, is that because understanding MMT opens up all these policy opportunities, right? Then it's fair to say that if many countries around the world understood MMT, they would be able to do things that they had not been able to achieve before in terms of developing their countries and provisioning for their own communities. In which case, what would happen to the world order currencies? As you say, it might shift things and we don't really know where it might land.
So there's a section in this chapter of the deficit myth entitled Out of the Bretton Woods into the Free Trade Fire. Patricia, what was the Bretton Woods system?
Well, the Bretton Woods system was an agreement within many Western economies to kind of enact a sort of monetary order by which all these countries had to guarantee convertibility of their currencies into the US dollars to within 1% of fixed parity rates. So it was a fixed exchange rate agreement, effectively.
The dollar was fixed to gold at $35 per ounce of gold, and then the rest of the currencies in the Bretton Woods Agreement pegged to the dollar at a fixed rate. So it was basically a way to put the entire system onto the gold standard, basically.
At that time, trade deficits were an issue because you had to maintain parity with the US dollar. So you couldn't just have infinite trade deficits. You had to keep that under control. And I guess that's why it begins to be perceived as a negative, right? A trade deficit.
This is where the whole thing stems from, yeah.
Exactly. And I think Stephanie does touch upon that in the chapter. And the IMF, at the time, it was meant to help lend reserve currencies to those nations with trade deficits. And in a way, trying to balance things out so that these nations don't maintain trade deficits for too long. And then they have a trade surplus and the whole thing balances out great. The issue, of course, is that it reduces monetary sovereignty and thus your ability to maintain full employment. And that way it was a disaster.
And yeah, and let's be clear, the consequences of not having full employment, having insecure workforces and not a very good social compact within countries is the thing that drives world wars and fascism. And do you know what I mean? And so if an economic system's got any point, it's about not having those things. So ultimately, Bretton Woods was abandoned in the 70s, basically. Nixon took the US off of gold in the 70s, and then the rest of the countries floated their currencies as well. I guess this is the story of nations learning quite slowly that they're being held back by arbitrary rules. And we can't do that because we've got to protect this exchange rate. Okay, or now we've got to have unemployment. And sorry, why are we doing this again? It's supposed to be sort of enriching our nations, and it's doing the opposite.
So it was a gold standard, right? Effectively.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the good thing, I guess, is that it led to fiat currencies being wildly adopted as the best way to run your economy. But it is premised on this idea that maintaining price stability by means of fixing your currency against a fixed commodity like gold, it's the best thing you can do for your economy. It's better for investment. Everything just fixes itself.
Fix the exchange rate and let the other circumstances float around that.
Yeah.
Whereas what Stephanie says, and I think it's a great way of putting it, no. Fix on the actual real world goals that you want in your nation and let the deficit float around that and let the exchange rate float around that. The consequences of these things floating are much better than the consequences of having them fixed and letting everything else just fall around that.
That being said, I wouldn't object to a labor standard, which is a job guarantee.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Fixing on a real world outcome, full employment, and letting the numbers float around that.
And if labor in the world of capitalism is a commodity, then you're fixing your currency against a commodity. It just happens to be the labor commodity.
So rounded off, towards the end of the chapter, Stephanie writes passionately about the urgent need to ditch the trade war narrative and replace it with a focus on an all-hands-on-deck effort to bring about trade peace. How can economic activists in the global north and the global south go about furthering that goal as you see it, Patricia?
I think trade peace, I don't know how Stephanie frames it in her book, but trade peace is really about bringing the priorities back from simply seeing trade as a means of acquiring monetary units.
And game and a conquest and all that stuff.
But seeing trade as a means of furthering environmental goals across the world and furthering social goals across the world. So you could have trade treaties that actually have a job guarantee as part of that deal, or that you commit to certain environmental standards in order to fulfill that deal. And then what countries you trade with would be related primarily to your social and ethical goals of the nation. So you can choose to not to trade with a country that has high levels of exploitation and that has no regard for the environment, and choose to favor those countries that actually do take care of the environment and have good level of social provisioning. So that would be an ideal instead of just focus on make the most money possible. It's too narrow, the focus at the moment.
Great stuff. And as Stephanie Kelton puts it at the end of chapter 5 of The Deficit Myth, we only share one planet. Our current trade system is not up to the task of meeting the social and economic challenges of global poverty and joblessness. Meanwhile, we need a global all-hands-on-deck effort to deal with climate change. Trade peace isn't something we can achieve. It's something we can't afford not to achieve. So we'll leave it there and we'll do more of these Deficit Myth episodes as time permits until we get to the end of the book. We'd advise anyone listening to buy The Deficit Myth, or if you've already got a copy, buy another one for a friend or chancellor in your life. We look forward to next time when we'll continue to consolidate on and enthuse about what we've learned from people like Stephanie Kelton and all the other MMT scholars. But for now, thanks as ever for the time you've put into understanding and spreading the word about MMT. And thanks for joining us today on the MMT podcast.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.